Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Mask Falls. Troy Sinclair had built his life on two fundamental principles. Loyalty was everything, and betrayal was unforgivable. As he lay motionless in the hospital bed, his breathing steady and eyes closed, he listened to his wife of 12 years destroy everything he thought he knew about his family. "We'll build a better life without your useless father," Holly whispered to their two children, Mason and Chloe, ages 10 and 8. Her voice carried a venom Troy had never heard before. "He's been holding us back for years. Once he's gone, we can finally be happy." The words cut deeper than the surgeon's scalpel that had removed the tumor from his brain just 18 hours earlier. Troy's recovery had been faster than expected, his consciousness returning while the medical staff believed he remained in a post-surgical coma. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man they thought was brain damaged was hearing every calculated word of their betrayal. "But what if Daddy wakes up?" Chloe's small voice trembled with confusion. "He won't, sweetheart," Holly replied with cold certainty. "And even if he did, he'd never be the same. Derek explained it to me. The surgery, it changes people. Makes them different. Broken. Derek." Troy's blood pressure monitor would have screamed if he'd allowed his rage to surface. Derek Hoffman, his business partner, his best friend since college. The man who'd been best man at his wedding. The man who'd apparently been planning his downfall while sharing dinners at his table. Troy had spent 15 years building Apex Security Solutions from nothing into a multi-million-dollar private military company. What his family didn't know, what nobody except a select few knew, was that Troy Sinclair wasn't his real name. Before Apex, before Holly, before the suburban life in Denver, he'd been Troy Kellerman, a covert operative for a government agency that officially didn't exist. His retirement had been part of an elaborate cover, his marriage and family initially intended as deep cover that had evolved into something he thought was real. The conversation continued as Holly outlined their escape plan. Derek had already moved money from the business accounts. They'd leave tonight while Troy was unconscious, drive to Derek's cabin in Montana, then disappear entirely. The life insurance would eventually pay out, especially with Derek's testimony about Troy's deteriorating mental state following the surgery. "Mason, help your sister pack only the essentials," Holly instructed. "We can't take much, but Derek says we won't need anything from our old life." Troy heard his 10-year-old son, the boy he'd taught to ride a bike, to throw a fastball, to stand up to bullies, respond with enthusiasm that shattered what remained of his heart. "Cool. This is like the spy movies you and Derek watch. Are we really going to disappear forever?" "Forever and always, baby. No more worrying about your father's mood swings or his boring security work. Derek's going to teach you real skills, hunting, fishing, survival stuff." As their footsteps faded down the hospital corridor, Troy opened his eyes for the first time since his surgery. The private room was dimly lit, machines humming softly around him. But his mind was crystal clear, sharper than it had been in years. The tumor that had been causing his headaches and occasional memory lapses was gone, and with it, any illusion about the people he'd trusted most. Nurse Patricia Kowalski entered for her evening rounds, a seasoned woman in her 50s who'd worked intensive care for 20 years. She checked his monitors, made notes on her chart, then paused when she noticed his eyes were open. "Mr. Sinclair, can you hear me?" Troy studied her face, noting the slight recognition in her eyes. Something told him she knew more than she was letting on. "How long?" he asked, his voice hoarse but clear. Patricia glanced toward the door, then leaned closer. "Your surgery was yesterday. Your family, they left about an hour ago. Packed bags." She hesitated, then added quietly, "I know who you really are, Troy. My brother was Daniel Kowalski, Danny Kaye from the Sarajevo operation." Danny Kaye. Troy remembered him, a communications specialist who died saving their entire team when an extraction went sideways. Patricia's resemblance to her brother was subtle but unmistakable once she'd pointed out. "Danny saved my life," Troy said simply. He talked about you before that last mission. Said if anything happened to him, Troy Kellerman was the only man in the world he'd trust to watch over his family. She pulled out her phone, showing him a news alert. This went live 20 minutes ago. The headline read, Apex Security CO Troy Sinclair awakens from surgery. Makes full recovery. Below was a photo of Troy from last year's security conference. I took the liberty of contacting Channel 7, Patricia explained. Told them the tumor removal was successful and you were awake and coherent. They're calling it a miracle recovery. She smiled grimly. I figured if people were planning to disappear, they should know you're not as helpless as they think. Troy's phone, which sat on the bedside table, began buzzing incessantly. 63 missed calls and counting, all from Holly's number. He could imagine her panic. Their carefully planned escape had just become infinitely more complicated. Patricia, Troy said, sitting up with surprising ease, I need you to do something for me. Tell the doctors I'm insisting on being discharged tonight. Medical advice be damned. That's not advisable. You just had brain surgery. I've had worse. Troy's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to life or death decisions. And I have some family matters to attend to. As Patricia reluctantly agreed to speak with the attending physician, Troy stared out the window at the Denver skyline. Somewhere out there, 3 people who'd shared his name and his table were learning that their victim wasn't nearly as helpless as they'd assumed. They'd made one critical error in their planning. They'd forgotten that before Troy Sinclair, the businessman, existed, Troy Kellerman, the operative, had survived situations that would break ordinary men. And Troy Kellerman never forgave betrayal. The hunt was about to begin. Chapter 2. The Wolf Remembers. The discharge process took 4 hours of arguing with doctors, signing liability waivers, and convincing medical staff that Troy's insistence on leaving was born of sound mind rather than post-surgical confusion. By midnight, he was walking out of Denver General with a clean bill of health and a prescription for pain medication he had no intention of taking. His first stop was the Apex security offices in downtown Denver. The building was dark except for emergency lighting, but Troy had access codes that Derek didn't know existed. He made his way to the executive floor, past the awards and commendations that decorated the walls. Photographs of him and Derek receiving contract from Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, and private entities that needed protection services. In his private office, Troy accessed a hidden safe behind a false panel. Inside were items from his previous life, encrypted phones, identity documents, and most importantly, contact information for people who'd moved mountains when Troy Kellerman asked them to. He powered up a secure satellite phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in 5 years. Mongoose, came the gravelly voice on the other end. It's Phantom, Troy replied, using his old call sign. I need a favor. A long pause. Jesus, Troy. Heard you went soft. Wife, kids, the whole suburban nightmare. Nightmare's accurate. I need full surveillance on 3 targets, immediate deployment. And I need the Morrison cabin in Montana monitored. Morrison cabin. That's the off-grid place near Glacier National Park? That's the one. How fast can you have eyes on it? Give me 6 hours. What's the situation? Troy outlined the betrayal in clinical terms, keeping emotion out of his voice. Mongoose, real name Carl Rodriguez, had been Troy's intelligence coordinator for 7 years of Black Ops. He now ran a private intelligence firm that operated in legal gray areas. Damn, brother. Your own family. Former family, Troy corrected. I need to know everything about Derek Hoffman's activities for the past 6 months. Financial records, communications, travel patterns. Everything. Consider done. What's your timeline? They think they have a head start, but they're not dealing with Troy Sinclair anymore. They're dealing with me. After ending the call, Troy spent the next hour accessing Apex's financial records. Derek had been cleverly skimming money for months, but he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd used corporate accounts that Troy had access to through back doors Derek didn't know existed. The theft totaled nearly $2 million, moved through a series of shell companies that ultimately led back to Derek's personal accounts. But Troy wasn't interested in financial recovery. Money could be replaced. Trust, once broken, was permanent. His secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Mongoose. Eyes on cabin. 3 vehicles present. Heat signatures show 4 adults, 2 children. Your targets are there. 4 adults. That meant Derek wasn't alone. He'd brought backup. Troy's smile was cold as he typed back. Maintain surveillance. Do not engage. I'm coming. The drive from Denver to northern Montana took 12 hours, but Troy made it in 9. The Ducati motorcycle he'd retrieved from a storage unit outside the city was built for speed, and the highways were empty in the pre-dawn hours. As he rode, he made additional phone calls to contacts across the country. People who owed him favors, people who feared him, people who understood that Troy Kellerman always collected his debts. By the time he reached the surveillance position Mongoose had established, the sun was setting behind the Rocky Mountains. Carl Rodriguez met him at a concealed observation post overlooking the Cabin Valley. Good to see you, Phantom, Mongoose said, handing Troy a pair of high-powered binoculars. Though you look like hell, brain surgery will do that. Troy focused the binoculars on the cabin below. What's the situation? Derek Hoffman, your wife Holly, and your 2 kids. Plus 2 additional males, Marcus Webb and Antonio Rivera. Both have records. Webb for armed robbery, Rivera for assault and drug trafficking. Looks like Derek recruited some muscle for protection. Troy studied the men through the binoculars. Webb and Rivera were posted as sentries, carrying hunting rifles and communicating via handheld radios. This wasn't a simple escape plan. It was a fortress mentality. Derek's more paranoid than I gave him credit for, Troy observed. He knows I'm not the suburban businessman he's been manipulating. There's more, Mongoose continued. I intercepted communications between Derek and a contact in Mexico. He's planning to move the family across the border tomorrow night. New identities, permanent relocation. Troy lowered the binoculars. His children, Mason and Chloe, were inside that cabin, probably scared and confused, being told lies about their father by people who'd stolen them from their home. The rage that had been building since he'd overheard Holly's whispered betrayal crystallized into something cold and calculating. I need 3 things, Troy said. First, I need the local sheriff's department to receive an anonymous tip about suspicious activity at this cabin. Drug trafficking, armed individuals, child endangerment. But not for 12 hours. Giving yourself time to work? Exactly. Second, I need Derek's communication equipment jammed starting at midnight. Total blackout. Done. What's the third thing? Troy's smile was predatory. I need you to disappear for the next 6 hours. Whatever happens in that valley, you never saw me here. Mongoose studied his old partner's face. Troy, those are your kids down there. Mason and Chloe are innocent. They'll be protected. Troy's voice was granite. But Holly made her choice when she decided to steal my children and disappear with my business partner. And Derek made his choice when he recruited armed criminals to help him. What about the muscle? Marcus Webb and Antonio Rivera signed their own death warrants when they agreed to help kidnap children. Troy began checking the equipment he'd retrieved from his motorcycle. Some sins don't deserve forgiveness. As Mongoose packed up the surveillance equipment, Troy prepared for the descent into the valley. He'd given his family every opportunity to build a real life together. He'd retired from the shadow world, created a legitimate business, tried to be the husband and father they deserved. But they'd seen his kindness as weakness, his love as something to exploit. Tonight, they'd learned the difference between Troy Sinclair, the businessman, and Troy Kellerman, the operative. Some lessons could only be taught in blood. Chapter 3. The Devil's Gambit. The cabin sat in a natural depression surrounded by dense pine forest, accessible only by a single dirt road that wound through the mountains. Troy spent 2 hours studying the terrain, identifying approach routes and escape paths. Derek had chosen the location well, isolated, defensible, with clear sight lines in all directions. But he'd made the location choice thinking like a businessman, not like someone who'd spent years infiltrating enemy strongholds. At 11:45 p.m., Troy began his approach. He moved through the forest like a shadow, his black tactical gear blending with the darkness between the trees. The moon was a thin crescent, providing just enough light for his night vision equipment without exposing his position. Marcus Webb was stationed at the front perimeter, smoking a cigarette and checking his phone. Antonio Rivera patrolled the rear approach, following a predictable pattern that spoke to his lack of professional training. Both men were armed but careless. They expected trouble to announce itself with sirens and flashing lights, not emerge from the darkness like a specter. Troy reached Rivera first. The man was 20 yards from the cabin's rear entrance, rifle slung casually over his shoulder as he paused to light a cigarette. Troy moved with practiced silence, closing the distance in seconds. Rivera never heard him coming. The chokehold was precise and efficient. Rivera had time for one startled gasp before unconsciousness claimed him. Troy lowered the body silently, relieved the man of his weapon and radio, then secured him with zip ties. Rivera would wake up in several hours with a headache and no memory of how he'd ended up bound in the forest. Webb proved equally unprofessional. When Rivera failed to check in over the radio, Webb simply assumed equipment failure rather than investigating. Troy found him still at his post, now playing a game on his phone with his back turned to the forest. "Marcus Webb," Troy said quietly, materializing from the shadows. Webb spun around, fumbling for his rifle, but found himself staring down the barrel of Troy's sidearm. "You have a choice," Troy continued in the same conversational tone. "You can walk away from this situation with your life, or you can continue working for Derek Hoffman and discover what happens to people who threaten my children." Webb's eyes were wide with panic. "Look, man, I don't know what this is about. Derek just hired us for security. Said his business partner might cause trouble. Derek lied to you. This isn't about business." Troy stepped closer, and Webb could see the cold certainty in his eyes. "He kidnapped my children and stole my wife. You're helping him do it. I didn't know about kids. Derek said it was a custody dispute, that you were dangerous." "I am dangerous," Troy confirmed. "Extremely dangerous. But not to children and not to people who walk away when they realize they're on the wrong side." Webb dropped his rifle and raised his hands. "I'm gone, man. I never saw you. Smart choice. Start walking toward the road. Don't look back. Don't contact Derek. Don't stop until you reach civilization." Troy's voice carried absolute authority. "If I see you again, the conversation will be much shorter." Webb stumbled toward the dirt road, disappearing into the darkness. Troy watched him go, then moved toward the cabin. Through the windows, he could see warm light and movement. His family gathered around Derek like he was their savior instead of their captor. He circled the building, noting the layout and planning his entry. The cabin had 3 bedrooms, a main living area, and a kitchen. Derek was in the living room with Holly, their heads close together as they studied what looked like travel documents. Mason and Chloe were in one of the bedrooms, apparently asleep. Troy's secure phone vibrated with a message from Mongoose. "Sheriff Department received anonymous tip. Response team dispatched. ETA 40 minutes. Perfect timing. Troy needed 30 minutes to have the conversations that would determine how this situation ended. He approached the cabin's front door and knocked. 3 sharp raps that echoed through the mountain silence. "Webb," Derek's voice called from inside. "Rivera? Everything okay out there?" Troy knocked again, same pattern. Footsteps approached the door. Derek's shadow appeared in the window as he peered outside, then moved away. "Ollie, something's wrong. Webb and Rivera aren't answering their radios, and now someone's at the door." "Maybe they went into town," Holly suggested, but her voice carried tension. Derek was smarter than his hired muscle. He approached the door with his weapon drawn, using the peephole to scan the front porch. Finding it empty, he hesitated. Troy had positioned himself against the wall beside the door, invisible from the peephole's view. "I know you're out there," Derek called through the door. "Identify yourself." "Hello, partner," Troy replied calmly. "I think we need to talk." The silence that followed was deafening. Troy could hear Holly's sharp intake of breath, then rapid footsteps as she presumably ran to check on the children. "Troy," Derek's voice was tight with disbelief. "You're supposed to be in the hospital. Miraculous recovery. The doctors are calling it a medical breakthrough." Troy's tone remained conversational. "I saw the news report myself." Channel 7 was very thorough. More silence, then whispered conversation inside. Troy could imagine Derek's panic as he realized their carefully planned escape had been built on false assumptions. "The children are safe," Troy continued. This conversation is between adults. Open the door, Derek. Let's finish what you started. I'm armed, Derek warned. So am I. But I'm not here to shoot you through a door like a coward. Troy paused, letting that sink in. Although if you prefer, I can wait for the sheriff's department. They'll be here in about 30 minutes, responding to reports of armed individuals and possible child endangerment. The door opened slowly. Derek stood in the entrance, pistol in hand, but not directly aimed at Troy. His face was pale, eyes darting between Troy and the forest beyond. Where are Webb and Rivera? Rivera is taking a nap in the woods. Webb decided this wasn't his fight and left. Troy stepped into the doorway, forcing Derek to back into the cabin. Smart man. Unlike some people, he recognized a losing position when he saw one. Holly appeared from the bedroom hallway, her face a mask of fury and fear. You were supposed to be brain damaged, incapacitated. Sorry to disappoint you. Troy's eyes moved between his wife and his former business partner. Though I have to admit, discovering your little conspiracy was quite educational. 12 years of marriage, and I never knew you were such a talented actress. You were suffocating us, Holly snapped. Your paranoia, your control, your boring life. Derek showed me what we could have together. What you could have with $2 million of my money, Troy corrected. Let's not romanticize theft and betrayal. Derek's gun hand was shaking slightly. Look, Troy, we can work this out. The money can be returned. We'll call it a misunderstanding. Troy laughed, a sound devoid of humor. A misunderstanding? You stole my children, Derek. You convinced my wife to abandon our marriage, and you recruited armed criminals to help you disappear with everything I built. His voice grew colder. There's no misunderstanding here. This is betrayal, plain and simple. The kids don't have to be part of this, Holly said desperately. They're asleep. We can settle this quietly. You made them part of this when you whispered poison in their ears beside my hospital bed, Troy replied. When you told them their father was useless and they'd be better off without him. Holly's face crumpled with the realization that Troy had heard everything. But you're right about one thing, Troy continued. The children don't need to see what happens next. So here's what's going to occur. You're going to wake Mason and Chloe and tell them there's been a change of plans. You're going to explain that Daddy recovered faster than expected and wants to take them home. And then what? Derek asked. Troy's smile was arctic. Then you and I are going to have a much longer conversation about the consequences of betrayal. Without witnesses. Outside, the distant sound of sirens began to echo through the mountain valleys. The sheriff's department was ahead of schedule. Time's running out, Troy observed. Make your choice, Holly. Wake the children and send them to me, or explain to law enforcement why you're holding them in a cabin with armed criminals while their father recovers from brain surgery. Holly looked between Troy and Derek, her face reflecting the collapse of all her carefully laid plans. Derek, she whispered, what do we do? Derek's response would determine whether the next few minutes ended in surrender or violence. And Troy was prepared for either outcome. Chapter 4. Blood and Reckoning. The sirens were less than 5 minutes away when Holly finally moved toward the bedroom where Mason and Chloe slept. Her hand shook as she reached for the door handle, then stopped. No, she said, turning back to face Troy. I won't let you manipulate them. They're better off without you. Derek raised his pistol, pointing it directly at Troy's chest. She's right. You're the problem, Troy. You always have been. Controlling, paranoid, living in the past. We're giving those kids a future you never could. Troy studied both of them with the detached analysis he'd once applied to enemy combatants. So this is your choice? You'd rather face kidnapping charges than admit you made a mistake. The only mistake was not doing this sooner, Holly spat. You're a dinosaur, Troy. Your military background, your precious security business, it's all just glorified violence. Mason and Chloe deserve better. You're absolutely right, Troy said calmly. They do deserve better. Better than a mother who abandons her family for money and a stepfather who steals from his best friend. The bedroom door opened, and Mason appeared, rubbing his eyes. Mom? What's happening? Why are there sirens? Holly moved quickly to intercept him, but Troy's voice carried across the room with paternal authority. Mason, come here, son. The 10-year-old looked confused, glancing between his parents. Dad? Mom said you were sick, that you might not wake up. I'm fine, buddy. Just had a headache that needed fixing. Troy kept his voice gentle despite the weapon pointed at him. Why don't you and Chloe come with me? We need to talk. He's lying to you, Holly said desperately. The surgery changed him, Mason. He's not the same person. Mason studied his father's face with the serious expression that had always reminded Troy of himself. You look the same to me, Dad. Derek's finger tightened on the trigger. Troy, call off the police. Tell them it was a false alarm. I can't do that, Derek. See, I never called them. Troy's smile was predatory. A concerned citizen reported suspicious activity. Armed individuals at an isolated cabin, possible drug trafficking, child endangerment. The kind of call that brings a full tactical response. The sirens were deafening now, vehicles pulling up outside the cabin. Bright lights flooded through the windows as the sheriff's department surrounded the building. Sheriff's department. Exit the building with your hands visible. Derek's panic was complete now. He swung the gun between Troy and the front door, his breathing rapid and shallow. This is your fault, he snarled at Troy. Everything's ruined because you couldn't just stay unconscious. Actually, everything's ruined because you're a thief and a kidnapper, Troy corrected. But I'm willing to make this simple for you. He stepped closer to Derek, close enough that the gun barrel was nearly touching his chest. Shoot me, Troy said quietly. Pull the trigger, Derek. In front of my son, in front of the police outside, with evidence of your financial crimes already in the hands of federal investigators. See how that works out for you. Derek's hand was shaking violently now. You're insane. No, I'm informed. While you were planning your great escape, I was making phone calls. The FBI has copies of all your financial records. The money you stole has been frozen in every account you thought was secret. Your Mexico contact? He's been arrested. There's no escape plan anymore, Derek. There's only consequences. The front door burst open as tactical officers flooded the cabin. Drop your weapons. Get on the ground. Derek turned toward the officers, his gun still in hand. It was exactly the wrong move at the wrong time. Gun, one of the officers shouted. Troy moved faster than Derek could react, slamming into his former partner and driving him to the ground. The pistol discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as they fell, then skittered across the floor. Clear, Troy shouted, rolling away from Derek with his hands visible. Weapon is clear. The tactical team swarmed the cabin, securing Derek with professional efficiency. Holly was handcuffed as well, her protests about custody rights falling on deaf ears as officers found the stolen financial documents scattered across the coffee table. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a graying veteran who'd known Troy during his civilian years in Denver, helped him to his feet. Troy Sinclair, right? Heard you had brain surgery yesterday. Feeling much better now, Troy replied, watching as Derek was led away in handcuffs. Thank you for the fast response. Anonymous tip about armed individuals and child endangerment, Bradley explained, though it looks like our tipster was well informed. Mason and Chloe emerged from the bedroom, looking scared and confused. Troy knelt to their level, his voice gentle. It's okay, kids. Everything's going to be fine now. Are Mom and Derek in trouble? Chloe asked, tears in her eyes. They made some bad choices, Troy explained. But that's not your fault, and it doesn't change how much I love you. As the sheriff's deputies processed the scene, Troy made additional phone calls to contacts who would ensure Derek and Holly face federal charges for the financial crimes in addition to the kidnapping allegations. The evidence was overwhelming, the documentation thorough. But as he watched his children being comforted by paramedics, Troy realized his revenge was far from complete. Holly and Derek would face justice through the legal system, but justice and revenge were different things entirely. Over the next several hours, as statements were taken and charges filed, Troy learned the full scope of their betrayal. Holly had been planning to leave him for 8 months, convinced by Derek that Troy's post-military life made him a liability. They'd been having an affair for over a year, using business trips as cover for their relationship. Most damaging of all, they'd been systematically poisoning his children's perception of him, telling them their father was unstable, dangerous, and holding the family back from happiness. As dawn broke over the Montana mountains, Troy sat in Sheriff Bradley's office with Mason and Chloe, waiting for social services to complete their evaluation. The children would be going home with him, but the psychological damage would take time to heal. "Dad," Mason said quietly, "were you really sick? In your brain?" "I had a tumor that was causing headaches," Troy explained honestly. "The doctors removed it, and now I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. Derek said you might become violent, that you had episodes." Troy felt the cold rage return, but kept his voice steady. "Derek told you a lot of things that weren't true, son. He was trying to make you afraid of me, so you wouldn't want to come home. But why would he do that?" It was a child's question that deserved an honest answer. Because some people think lying is easier than facing the consequences of their choices. "Derek stole money from our business and convinced your mother to help him. When they decided to disappear, they needed you and Chloe to go willingly." Chloe, who'd been quiet through most of the ordeal, finally spoke up. "I don't want to go with Derek anymore. He was mean when you weren't around." Troy pulled both children closer, feeling the weight of fatherhood settle around him like armor. Holly and Derek were in prison, their legal troubles just beginning. But the deeper revenge, the kind that would truly balance the scales, would take time and patience. His family had been stolen from him, his children's love poisoned against him, his trust betrayed by the people closest to him. The law would punish them for their crimes, but Troy Kellerman had learned long ago that some debts could only be paid in suffering. As they drove back toward Denver, Troy's phone buzzed with a message from Mongoose. Rivera found and arrested. Webb turned himself into authorities in Billings. Clean sweep. Troy typed back. Phase 1 complete. Phase 2 begins when they're transferred to federal custody. In the rearview mirror, he could see Mason and Chloe sleeping in the back seat, finally safe. They'd been through enough trauma. They would be protected from what came next. But Holly and Derek's ordeal was just beginning. They thought prison would be their punishment, but Troy had spent years building relationships with people who operated in the gray spaces between legal and illegal. People who understood that some betrayals demanded a more personal form of justice. The reckoning had only begun. Chapter 5. The Price of Betrayal. 6 months after the Montana incident, Holly sat in the federal courthouse in Denver, listening to the judge sentence her to 8 years in prison for conspiracy, kidnapping, and money laundering. Derek received 12 years for the same charges, plus additional counts of embezzlement and fraud. Their lawyers had negotiated the best deals possible, but the evidence was overwhelming. Troy watched from the gallery, his face impassive as the woman who'd shared his bed for 12 years was led away in shackles. Mason and Chloe weren't present. They were at school, living as normal a life as he could provide after the upheaval. They'd been in therapy for months, slowly understanding that their mother's version of events hadn't been truthful. Outside the courthouse, Derek's lawyer approached Troy with an offer. "Mr. Sinclair, my client would like to speak with you. He's hoping to make amends, perhaps work out some kind of restitution arrangement." Troy studied the lawyer with cold eyes. "Restitution? The financial damages to your company. Derek understands he can't undo what happened, but he'd like to try to make things right. Set up the meeting," Troy replied after a moment. "Tomorrow, 2 p.m., at the Federal Detention Center." The lawyer seemed relieved. "Thank you. Derek will be grateful for the opportunity." Troy said nothing. Gratitude was the last thing Derek would feel when he learned what Troy had planned for him. The next day, Troy sat across from Derek in the detention center's visiting room. His former partner looked haggard, the stress of imprisonment already taking its toll. Dark circles under his eyes, weight loss, the nervous tics of a man realizing his life was effectively over. "Troy, thank you for coming," Derek began. "I know what I did was unforgivable, but I want you to know I regret everything. The money, Holly, the kids. I got caught up in something I should have walked away from." "Tell me about the regret," Troy said conversationally. "When did it start? When you were stealing from me? When you were sleeping with my wife? Or when you convinced my children their father was dangerous?" Derek flinched at each question. "I know you hate me. I deserve that. But I'm hoping we can find a way forward. Some kind of arrangement that helps repair the damage." "You're right," Troy agreed. "We do need an arrangement, but not the kind you're thinking." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Derek, Do you remember our conversation about my military background? How I always kept the details vague. Derek nodded uncertainly. I wasn't just military. I was something much more specialized. I worked for people who don't officially exist, doing things that never happened, in places that aren't on any map. Troy's smile was arctic. For 15 years, I eliminated problems that couldn't be solved through conventional means. The color drained from Derek's face. When I retired, I thought I was done with that life. I built Apex, married Holly, had children. I tried to be a normal person. Troy paused, studying Derek's growing terror. But you brought that other person back, Derek. You reminded me who I really am. Troy, please. I'm going to prison. I'll lose everything. Isn't that enough? Prison. Troy laughed softly. Derek, prison is the least of your concerns. You see, I've spent the last 6 months making phone calls to old friends. People who work in federal corrections. People who have influence with certain inmate populations. Derek's breathing became rapid and shallow. Franklin Correctional, where you're being transferred next week, has an interesting demographic, Troy continued. 40% of the inmates have children. Many of them are fathers who lost custody because of their crimes. They have very strong feelings about men who kidnap children from their families. You can't do this, Derek whispered. I'm not doing anything. I'm simply sharing information. Your name, your crimes, your cell assignment. What happens after that is entirely up to them. Troy stood to leave. Although, I should mention, I've also arranged for copies of your financial records to be distributed. The inmates will know exactly how much money you stole from your best friend's family. Derek lurched to his feet, desperation in his voice. Troy, I'll pay it all back. Every penny. I'll sign over everything I own. You don't own anything anymore, Troy replied calmly. Your assets were seized. Your bank account's frozen. Your life insurance policy canceled. Even if you survive your sentence, you'll be released with nothing but the clothes on your back and the knowledge that every moment of suffering was earned. As Troy walked toward the exit, Derek called after him. What about Holly? She's the mother of your children. Troy stopped but didn't turn around. Holly made her choice when she decided Mason and Chloe would be better off without their father. Now she gets to live with the consequences of that choice. The Federal Women's Correctional Facility where Holly was serving her sentence was a different kind of hell. Troy had made different arrangements for her, knowing that physical violence wasn't the appropriate punishment for her betrayal. Instead, he'd arranged for something far more psychologically devastating. Through contacts in the federal system, Troy ensured that Holly was assigned to work detail in the prison library, where she had access to newspapers and internet for educational purposes. Every day, she would see articles about successful Apex security contracts, photos of Troy receiving business awards, and most importantly, pictures of Mason and Chloe thriving in their new life. The children had indeed flourished once they were away from Holly's manipulation. Mason had joined the school baseball team and was excelling academically. Chloe had discovered a talent for art and was taking advanced placement classes. They spoke of their mother rarely, and when they did, it was with the confused sadness of children trying to understand how someone who claimed to love them could have abandoned them so completely. Troy made sure Holly saw every achievement, every milestone, every moment of happiness her children experienced without her. Each newspaper clipping, each school photo, each report card was a reminder of what she'd thrown away in pursuit of Derek's promises. But the most devastating element of Troy's revenge against Holly was simpler and more cruel than anything else. He told Mason and Chloe the truth. Not immediately, and not in a way that traumatized them further. But as they grew older and asked questions about why their mother had left, Troy answered honestly. He explained how Holly had planned to disappear with Derek, how she'd told them their father was useless, how she'd been willing to steal them away from everything they'd known. The children's reaction was exactly what Troy had expected, not anger, but disappointment. They were old enough to understand betrayal, old enough to recognize that their mother had chosen her own desires over their well-being. That disappointment would last far longer than any physical punishment. 3 years into her sentence, Holly requested a meeting with Troy. He agreed, curious to see how prison had changed her. She looked older, worn down by the reality of institutional life. Her hair was graying, her face lined with stress and regret. "The children won't take my calls," she said without preamble. "I've never prevented them from speaking with you." Troy replied truthfully. "That's their choice. You turned them against me." "No, Holly. You did that yourself when you whispered poison in their ears beside my hospital bed. I simply made sure they understood the truth about what happened." Holly's composure cracked. "Then my children too. I made mistakes, but I love them." "Love?" Troy's voice was incredulous. "You called their father useless. You told them they'd be better off without me. You were willing to steal them away from their home, their school, their friends, their entire lives. That's not love, Holly. That's selfishness. I thought Derek and I could give them a better life. With stolen money and false identities? Running from the law? That was your idea of a better life." Holly had no answer for that. "Here's the truth you need to understand," Troy continued. "Mason and Chloe are happy. They're thriving. They have friends, hobbies, goals for the future. They don't need the woman who abandoned them to disrupt that happiness with requests for forgiveness. So that's it. I serve my sentence and lose my children forever." Troy studied her face, seeing the desperate hope for some sign of mercy, some indication that redemption was possible. "You made your choice, Holly. You chose Derek over your family. You chose money over your children. You chose deception over truth." He stood to leave. "Now you live with those choices. Forever." As he walked away, Holly's sobs echoed through the visiting room. But Troy felt no satisfaction, no sense of closure. Revenge, he'd learned, was a cold dish that left everyone hungry. Still, justice had been served. The people who betrayed him were suffering the consequences of their actions, and his children were safe and loved and free from the poison Holly and Derek had tried to inject into their lives. Some debts could only be paid in suffering, and the debt was far from settled. Chapter 6, The Long Game. 5 years after the Montana incident, Troy stood in the rain outside Franklin Correctional Institution, watching as an ambulance carried Derek Hoffman's body away from the prison. The official cause of death was listed as complications from injuries sustained during an altercation with other inmates. But Troy knew the real story. Derek had survived 3 years of systematic psychological and physical abuse at the hands of inmates who'd been carefully informed about his crimes against children. The violence had escalated slowly, a push here, a threat there, gradually building to more serious assaults. Derek had spent the last 18 months in protective custody, isolated and terrified, barely eating, losing weight and sanity in equal measure. The final confrontation had been inevitable. For inmates, all fathers separated from their own children had cornered Derek in the prison laundry. The beating was thorough and merciless. Derek had died alone on the concrete floor, calling for help that never came. Prison warden Samuel Torres approached Troy in the parking lot, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Sinclair, I'm sorry for your loss." Troy studied the man's face, noting the subtle recognition in his eyes. Torres knew exactly who Troy was and what Derek's death meant. "Thank you, Warden. Derek made a lot of enemies with his choices." "Prison can be dangerous for certain types of offenders," Torres agreed. "Child predators, men who commit crimes against families. They don't fare well in general population. I'm sure you did everything you could to protect them. Of course, the resources are always limited." Torres paused, then added quietly, "The inmates responsible for this incident have been identified. They'll face additional charges." Troy nodded. The inmates would be prosecuted, but their sentences would be minimal. They'd killed a child kidnapper, which carried its own form of justice in the prison hierarchy. They'd be heroes to their fellow inmates, not pariahs. As Troy drove away from the prison, his phone buzzed with a message from Mason, now 15 years old and starting his sophomore year of high school. "Dad, saw the news about Derek. Are you okay?" Troy typed back, "I'm fine, son. Justice was served." "Good. Mom's been trying to call me again. Should I talk to her?" "That's your choice, Mason. You're old enough to decide for yourself." "I don't want to." "Is that wrong?" Troy considered his response carefully. "It's not wrong to protect yourself from people who've hurt you. Family is more than blood, son. It's about loyalty, trust, and love. Real love, not the kind that comes with conditions. The conversation ended there, but Troy felt a deep satisfaction. His children had learned to recognize betrayal and protect themselves from it. They'd grown into strong, independent young people who understood the value of loyalty and the consequences of breaking it. Holly would be released from federal prison in 2 years, but she'd return to a world that had moved on without her. Mason and Chloe had legally changed their last names to Sinclair permanently, cutting the final legal ties to their mother. They made it clear through their lawyers that they wanted no contact with her upon her release. Troy had ensured that Holly's post-prison life would be as difficult as possible. Her criminal record would prevent her from finding meaningful employment. The financial restitution requirements would ensure she remained in debt for decades. Most importantly, she'd lost the thing that mattered most to her, her children's love and respect. But Troy's revenge extended beyond just Holly and Derek. He'd spent 5 years systematically destroying everyone who'd helped them or enabled their betrayal. Marcus Webb, the hired muscle who'd walked away from the Montana cabin, had found his life slowly disintegrating. Employment opportunities disappeared due to anonymous tips about his criminal associations. Landlords refused to rent to him after receiving calls about his dangerous background. He'd been arrested 3 times on trumped-up charges that were eventually dropped, but not before costing him jobs and reputation. Webb had finally fled Denver entirely, moving to a small town in Wyoming where he worked construction and kept his head down. He learned that crossing Troy Sinclair carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate situation. The lawyers who'd initially helped Derek hide his financial crimes had faced their own reckoning. Anonymous tips to the Colorado Bar Association about ethics violations had resulted in investigations, suspensions, and in one case, disbarment. Their practices had crumbled, their reputations destroyed, their ability to practice law permanently compromised. Even Holly's sister, who'd helped her plan the initial escape, had faced consequences. Her husband's construction company had mysteriously lost several major contracts after anonymous complaints about safety violations and poor workmanship. Their marriage had suffered under the financial strain, ultimately ending in divorce. Troy's philosophy was simple. Betrayal was a contagion that had to be thoroughly eradicated. Anyone who'd helped Holly and Derek, anyone who'd known about their plans and failed to warn him, anyone who'd enabled their actions in any way, they all paid a price. The message was clear throughout Denver's business and social circles. Troy Sinclair was not a man to be crossed. His reputation as someone who never forgot a slight and never forgave betrayal became legendary. People spoke in whispers about what had happened to Derek and the others, warning their friends and colleagues to be careful in their dealings with the Apex Security CEO. But the most profound change was in Troy himself. The suburban businessman persona he'd cultivated for 15 years was gone, replaced by something harder and more calculating. He still loved his children with fierce intensity, still provided them with every opportunity and advantage. But the naive trust that had allowed Holly and Derek to manipulate him had been burned away completely. Mason and Chloe had inherited more than their father's name. They'd learned his philosophy about loyalty and consequences. They protected each other with the same intensity Troy protected them. They understood that trust was earned through actions, not words, and that betrayal was unforgivable. As Troy pulled into the driveway of their Denver home, he saw his children through the window, doing homework at the kitchen table. They were laughing about something, comfortable and secure in the knowledge that their father would always protect them from those who might harm them. The house was peaceful, stable, free from the toxicity Holly and Derek had tried to introduce. Troy had built something pure here, something that couldn't be corrupted by people who saw kindness as weakness or love as something to exploit. His phone buzzed with another message, this one from Mongoose. Package delivered to Holly's cell as requested. The package contained newspaper clippings from Derek's funeral, attended by no one except a court-appointed chaplain and a single guard. The articles detailed his death, the circumstances that led to it, and the complete absence of anyone willing to mourn his passing. Holly would read those articles and understand that Derek's promises of a better life had led to a lonely death in a prison cell. She'd realized that the man she'd abandoned her family for had died, despised and forgotten, killed by other inmates who saw him as the lowest form of criminal. Most importantly, she'd understand that Troy's revenge was patient, thorough, and complete. Derek was dead. Their co-conspirators had been systematically destroyed, and she would be released into a world that offered her nothing but consequences for her choices. The debt was nearly paid in full. Only one final payment remained, and that would come when Holly walked out of prison to discover that the life she'd thrown away was gone forever, replaced by nothing but regret and isolation. Troy Kellerman had learned long ago that some enemies could only be defeated through total destruction. And Holly Sinclair, soon to be Holly Matthews again, since she'd lost the right to his name, was about to learn the same lesson. Chapter 7. The Final Reckoning. Holly's release from federal prison came on a gray October morning, 3 months earlier than originally scheduled due to good behavior. She stepped through the gates of the women's correctional facility carrying a single bag of possessions and wearing the same clothes she'd been arrested in 7 years earlier. They no longer fit properly. Prison had aged her in ways that went beyond simple time. Troy was waiting for her in the parking lot, leaning against his black BMW with the patience of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. "Hello, Ollie," he said as she approached, his voice carrying the same conversational tone she remembered from their marriage. "Troy." Holly stopped 10 feet away, studying his face for any sign of the man she'd once thought she could manipulate. "I wasn't expecting you. I thought we should talk before you disappear into whatever life you've planned for yourself." Holly glanced around the empty parking lot, noting that they were alone except for the distant figures of guards in the prison towers. The children, Mason and Chloe, are 17 and 15 now. They're at school where they belong, living their lives without worrying about disruptions from people who abandoned them. The words hit Holly like physical blows, but she tried to maintain her composure. "I want to see them. They don't want to see you." Troy's response was matter-of-fact, delivered without cruelty or satisfaction. "They've made that very clear to their lawyers, to the court, and to me. Multiple times. They're minors. You could arrange something if you wanted to. Could I?" Troy tilted his head slightly. "Should I force my children to have contact with someone who called their father useless and try to steal them away from their home? Should I expose them to the woman who chose her boyfriend over their well-being?" Holly's composure began to crack. "I made mistakes, but I'm their mother." "No," Troy corrected gently. "Sarah Williams down in cell block C was a mother. She killed the man who was molesting her daughter and got 15 years for it. Janet Rodriguez in the library was a mother. She embezzled money to pay for her son's cancer treatment. You're a woman who gave birth to 2 children and then abandoned them for money and a man who died alone in a prison cell." The mention of Derek's death hit Holly like a sledgehammer. She'd received the newspaper clippings, had seen the photos of his funeral where no one came to mourn. But hearing Troy reference it so casually drove home the finality of everything she'd lost. "Derek's dead because of you," she whispered. "Derek's dead because he chose to betray the man who trusted him most, steal from that man's business, and kidnap that man's children," Troy replied. "Prison inmates have very specific ideas about justice for men who commit crimes against families. I didn't have to lift a finger." Holly stared at him, seeing something in his eyes that hadn't been there during their marriage. A coldness that spoke of experiences she'd never understood, capabilities she'd never recognized. "Who are you?" she asked. "The man I married would never have." "The man you married was pretending to be someone else," Troy interrupted. "I retired from my real life to build something normal with you and the children. I tried to be the suburban businessman you wanted me to be. But you destroyed that illusion when you chose to see kindness as weakness and love as something to exploit." He stepped closer, and Holly instinctively backed away. "Let me tell you about your new life, Holly. You have $17 in gate money, no credit, no employment history for the past 7 years, and a federal conviction for kidnapping and money laundering. Your sister won't return your calls because helping you destroyed her marriage. Your parents moved to Florida and changed their phone number. The house we shared was sold to pay legal fees and restitution." Holly's face went white as the full scope of her situation became clear. "But here's the beautiful part," Troy continued. "I'm not going to do anything to make your life harder than it already is. I don't need to. You're going to suffer every day for the rest of your life, knowing that you threw away everything that mattered for a fantasy that led to nothing but death and loneliness. The children will graduate high school, go to college, build careers and families of their own. They'll have wonderful lives filled with people who actually love them, not people who see them as pawns in some scheme for easy money." Troy's smile was arctic. "And you'll read about it all in the newspaper. Every graduation, every achievement, every milestone you'll never be part of." Holly's legs gave out, and she sank to her knees in the prison parking lot, the full weight of her choices finally crushing her completely. "Please," she whispered, "I know I can't undo what I did, but please don't shut me out of their lives forever. They're all I have left." Troy knelt beside her, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Holly, do you remember what you said to them beside my hospital bed? When you thought I couldn't hear you?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "You told them they'd build a better life without their useless father. You convinced them I was damaged, dangerous, holding them back from happiness." Troy paused, letting the words sink in. "Well, congratulations. They have built a better life. Without you." He stood and walked toward his car, then stopped and turned back. "There's a bus station in town. The 315 Greyhound goes to Colorado Springs, where there's a women's shelter that helps ex-offenders find housing and employment. I'd suggest you be on it. What if I refuse? What if I stay and try to contact the children anyway?" Troy's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes that made Holly understand she was looking at a man capable of things she'd never imagined. "Then you'll discover that Derek's fate wasn't unique. Some debts can only be paid in suffering, Holly. Yours is almost settled, but not quite. Don't make me add to the balance." As Troy drove away, Holly remained on her knees in a prison parking lot, surrounded by the wreckage of every choice she'd made. The fantasy of a better life with Derek had led to his death and her total isolation. The children she'd thought she was protecting from their father's influence had chosen him completely and rejected her entirely. 7 years in prison had taught her many things, but the most important lesson was this: some mistakes couldn't be undone, some choices couldn't be taken back, and some people never forgave betrayal. Troy Sinclair, or whoever he really was beneath the businessman facade, had proven himself to be exactly what Derek had claimed: dangerous. But not in the way Holly had been led to believe. His danger wasn't rooted in instability or violence. It was rooted in absolute certainty about loyalty and betrayal, and the patience to ensure that consequences were thorough and permanent. At 3:15 p.m., Holly boarded the Greyhound bus to Colorado Springs, carrying her single bag and the knowledge that she would spend the rest of her life paying for the decision to betray the man who'd loved her and the children who trusted her. Behind her, in Denver, Mason and Chloe Sinclair came home from school to find their father cooking dinner and helping with homework, the same way he had every day for the past 7 years. They didn't ask about their mother's release because they didn't need to know. That part of their lives was over, buried as completely as Derek Hoffman. Troy had taught them that family was built on loyalty, trust, and unconditional love, not biology, legal documents, or blood relations. They'd learned the lesson well. The debt was finally paid in full. Chapter 8: The Ghost's Legacy. 2 years after Holly's release, Troy stood in the audience of Mason's high school graduation, watching his son deliver the valedictorian speech to a gymnasium full of proud parents and excited teenagers. The young man on the stage bore little resemblance to the confused 10-year-old who'd been caught in the middle of adult betrayals. At 19, he'd skipped a grade due to his academic excellence. Mason had grown into someone who understood the world with uncommon clarity. "Success isn't measured by what you achieve," Mason said from the podium, his voice carrying the confidence Troy recognized from his own youth. "It's measured by how you treat the people who trust you with their loyalty and how you respond when that trust is tested." In the row beside Troy, 17-year-old Chloe recorded her brother's speech on her phone, beaming with pride. She'd grown into a remarkable young woman, artistic, intelligent, fiercely protective of the family unit they'd rebuilt. Like Mason, she'd learned early that trust was earned through actions, not words. Neither child had mentioned their mother in years. Holly had become a cautionary tale in their minds, a reminder of how people could pretend to love you while planning to abandon you. They'd moved beyond anger or sadness about her betrayal. She simply didn't exist in their emotional universe anymore. After the ceremony, Troy found himself approached by several other parents who'd gotten to know him through school events over the years. To them, he was simply a successful businessman who'd raised two exceptional children as a single father after his wife left the family. The truth was more complicated, but truth was often less important than the story people needed to believe. Troy called Rebecca Martinez, whose daughter had been in classes with Chloe. I heard Mason got a full scholarship to MIT. You must be so proud. I am, Troy replied honestly, though I can't take credit for his work ethic. That's all him. Still, raising two kids alone after your divorce, that couldn't have been easy. Troy's smile never wavered. They made it easy. Good kids make everything else manageable. Rebecca had no idea she was talking to a man who'd systematically destroyed everyone who'd betrayed his family, who'd orchestrated the death of his former business partner, who'd ensured his ex-wife would live the rest of her life in isolation and regret. To her, Troy Sinclair was just another dedicated father navigating life after his marriage ended. The carefully constructed facade had served its purpose. Troy's reputation in Denver was that of a man who'd overcome personal tragedy to build something better for his children. Apex Security Solutions had grown into one of the most successful firms in the region, its clients drawn to Troy's reputation for absolute reliability and discretion. What they didn't know was that Troy's definition of discretion extended far beyond simple business confidentiality. He'd learned to compartmentalize his life with surgical precision. The father and businessman existing in full view of the world, while the operative who'd eliminated threats to his family remained hidden in the shadows. That evening, as they celebrated Mason's graduation at his favorite restaurant, Troy watched his children interact with the easy affection of siblings who'd survived something together. They developed their own code of loyalty, their own understanding of what family meant when stripped of its illusions. "Dad," Chloe said during dessert, "Mason and I were talking about something." "Oh," Troy raised an eyebrow. "Should I be worried?" "We want to legally change our names again," Mason explained. "Not our last name. We're keeping Sinclair, but our middle names." Troy waited, curious about where this was heading. "We want to honor Mom," Chloe continued, and Troy felt his blood pressure spike before she clarified, "Patricia Kowalski, the nurse who helped you at the hospital that night. She saved our family when she called the news station." Troy felt something tight in his chest loosen. Patricia had indeed saved them, in ways his children couldn't fully understand. Her decision to alert the media about his recovery had destroyed Holly and Derek's escape plan and forced them into the desperate situation that led to their capture. "Patricia passed away last year," Mason added softly. "Cancer. We found out through her obituary. We'd like to carry her name as a way of remembering what she did for us." "Mason Patricia Sinclair and Chloe Patricia Sinclair," Troy said, testing the sound. "I think she would have been honored." The conversation moved on to other topics: Chloe's upcoming senior year, Mason's plans for MIT, the family vacation they'd take before he left for college. Normal family discussions that had taken years to feel natural again. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Troy sat in his study looking at the only photograph he kept from his previous life. It showed his old unit during a mission briefing in a place that didn't appear on any map. Young faces, hardened by experiences that couldn't be shared with civilians, bound together by loyalty that transcended blood relations. Most of those men were dead now, killed in operations that never happened or in the violent transitions that followed their return to civilian life. But they'd understood something that most people never learned. Family wasn't about biology or legal documents. It was about choosing to stand with someone regardless of the cost. Troy had tried to teach that lesson to Holly and Derek through patience and trust. When they'd rejected it, he'd taught them through consequences that would follow them to their graves. The lesson had taken, though not in the way he'd originally hoped. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Tomorrow marks 7 years. Thank you for the lesson. Holly. Somehow she'd gotten access to a phone and his number, reaching out on the anniversary of her betrayal. Troy stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. She no longer existed in his world. Acknowledging her attempt at contact would only validate her hope for some form of redemption. There was no redemption for betrayal. There was only acceptance of consequences. The next morning brought news that would have seemed like coincidence to anyone who didn't know Troy's true capabilities. Holly Matthews, her maiden name resumed after losing the right to his, had been found dead in her studio apartment in Colorado Springs. The cause was listed as apparent suicide, a deliberate overdose of pain medication she'd been prescribed for chronic back problems developed during her prison years. Troy read the brief newspaper article with the same emotional detachment he'd once applied to mission reports. Holly had finally accepted that her debt could only be paid through the ultimate sacrifice. Her death was neither tragic nor satisfying. It was simply the final calculation in an equation that had been building toward this conclusion for 7 years. Mason and Chloe would never know about their mother's death. As far as they were concerned, Holly had disappeared from their lives completely when she chose Derek over their family. Learning about her suicide wouldn't provide closure or peace. It would only create unnecessary pain. Instead, they would remember Patricia Kowalski, the nurse who'd saved their family with a single phone call. They would carry her name and her memory as a reminder that sometimes strangers showed more loyalty and courage than blood relatives. That afternoon, Troy made a phone call to a contact in Colorado Springs who would ensure Holly's burial was handled with minimal fanfare. No obituary, no memorial service, no notification to surviving family members who'd already moved on with their lives. She would disappear from the world as completely as she tried to disappear from his life 7 years earlier. The symmetry was perfect, the debt finally balanced. Derek had died despised and alone in a prison cell. Holly had died isolated and forgotten in a shabby apartment. The people who'd helped them had faced their own consequences, their lives systematically dismantled by the same patience and precision they'd underestimated in Troy. Only Mason and Chloe remained, and they were thriving. They'd learned the lessons Troy had tried to teach through love and were now strong enough to teach those lessons to others. The family he'd built from the ashes of betrayal was unbreakable, forged in fire and tempered by truth. Troy Kellerman was finally at peace. The suburban businessman facade was no longer necessary. His children knew who he really was and loved him completely. The operative who'd eliminated threats with surgical precision could rest, his mission accomplished. Some debts could only be paid in blood, but others could be paid in suffering, isolation, and the slow realization that every choice carried consequences. Holly and Derek had paid their debts in full, and their deaths marked the end of a story that had begun with whispered betrayal beside a hospital bed. In the end, Troy had proven something that both he and his enemies had forgotten during the years of suburban normalcy. Love was not weakness, kindness was not vulnerability, and trust was not naive. But betraying those things? That was unforgivable. The reckoning was complete. Chapter 9, New Beginnings. 5 years later, Troy stood at the edge of the MIT campus, watching Mason walk across the graduation stage to receive his doctoral degree in cybersecurity at the unprecedented age of 24. In the audience beside him, Chloe cheered loudly for her brother, her own Stanford MBA having been completed the previous year. Both children had inherited their father's intensity and focus, channeling it into achievements that amazed even Troy. The young man accepting his diploma bore the confidence of someone who understood the world's complexities without being broken by them. Mason had grown into a leader, someone who inspired loyalty through example rather than demanding it through manipulation. His doctoral thesis on quantum encryption had already been recruited by 3 government agencies and 2 Fortune 500 companies. Chloe had chosen a different path, combining her artistic talents with business acumen to build a non-profit organization that helped children from broken families find stability and support. Her work was driven by personal experience, but her approach was clinical and effective. She'd learned from Troy that emotion without action was useless, while action without emotion was hollow. After the ceremony, the three of them went to dinner at a quiet restaurant near campus. The conversation was easy, filled with the comfortable dynamic of people who'd survived something together and emerged stronger. "Dad," Mason said during dessert, "Chloe and I have something to tell you." Troy raised an eyebrow, recognizing the tone that usually preceded important announcements. "We've both been recruited for something interesting," Chloe continued. "A government program that identifies individuals with specific skill sets and family backgrounds." Troy felt his blood pressure spike slightly. "What kind of program?" "The kind where they know exactly who you really were before you became Troy Sinclair," Mason said quietly. "They know about Troy Kellerman, the operations that never happened, the people who officially don't exist. They also know how you handled the situation with Mom and Derek," Chloe added. "Not the official version, but the real story. What you did to protect us, how you eliminated the threats to our family." Troy studied both of his children, seeing something in their eyes that reminded him of his old unit. The look of people who'd been offered a chance to serve something larger than themselves. "They want to recruit you," he said. "It wasn't a question. They want to recruit all of us," Mason corrected. "A family unit with complementary skills. You with field experience and operational planning, me with cybersecurity and intelligence analysis, Chloe with psychological profiling and organizational management." "The Sinclair Group," Chloe said with a slight smile. "That's what they're calling it. A specialized team that handles situations requiring discretion." Troy leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. He'd spent years building a normal life for his children, only to discover they'd inherited more than his name. They'd inherited his calling. "You understand what this means?" he asked. "The life you'd be choosing? The things you might have to do." "We understand," Mason replied. "We've watched you balance two worlds for our entire lives. We've seen what happens when loyalty is betrayed and what it costs to protect the people you love. We've also seen what happens when good people do nothing because it's easier than doing what's right," Chloe added. "You taught us that some debts can only be paid through action, not good intentions." Troy thought about the years he'd spent trying to give them normal lives, only to realize that normal was overrated when it came at the cost of purpose. His children had grown up understanding that the world contained predators who preyed on the innocent, and that someone had to stand between them. "What about your current lives?" "Mason, you have job offers from every major tech company. Chloe, your nonprofit is making real impact." "The nonprofit will continue," Chloe said, "but it will have better funding and resources when it's backed by people who understand the mission. And cybersecurity threats don't respect corporate boundaries," Mason added. "The skills are transferable, but the impact could be much larger." Troy smiled, seeing the echoes of his younger self in their certainty. They'd found their calling the same way he had, through understanding that some people would always choose to hurt others, and that choice created an obligation for those capable of stopping them. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this as a family. We protect each other, we trust each other completely, and we never forget that loyalty is everything." "Agreed," both children said simultaneously. That night, in his hotel room, Troy made a phone call to a number he hadn't used in over a decade. "Mongoose," came the familiar voice. "It's Phantom. I'm back." A long pause. "Thought you were done with this life." "I try to be, but apparently, this life isn't done with me." "What changed?" Troy looked out the window at the MIT campus where his son had just graduated, thinking about the young woman who was already changing the world through her work with broken families. "My children grew up," he said simply, "and they chose to follow the path I try to protect them from. Good kids, the best. They understand what loyalty means, what betrayal costs, and what it takes to protect the people who can't protect themselves. Sounds like they learned from the right teacher." Troy thought about Holly and Derek, about the 7 years it had taken to balance the scales for their betrayal. He thought about Patricia Kowalski, who'd save his family with a single phone call. He thought about the difference between people who chose themselves over others and people who chose service over safety. "We start next month," Troy said. "Three-person team. Family unit." "The Sinclairs ride again?" "The Sinclairs ride for the first time," Troy corrected. Everything before this was just preparation. As he ended the call, Troy felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation for the future rather than satisfaction with the past. His children had chosen to become the people he'd always hoped they could be, not despite their experiences with betrayal and consequences, but because of them. They'd learned that the world was full of people like Holly and Derek, individuals who saw kindness as weakness and trust as something to exploit. But they'd also learned that such people could be stopped by those willing to pay the price for stopping them. The next morning, the three of them flew back to Denver together, discussing plans for the transition and a new life they'd build around their shared mission. As the plane lifted off from Boston, Troy looked down at the city where his son had just completed his education and realized that this was what victory actually looked like. Not the destruction of enemies, but the creation of something better from the ashes of their defeat. Mason and Chloe Patricia Sinclair would carry more than Patricia Kowalski's name into their new lives. They'd carry her example of choosing to help strangers, her willingness to take risks for people she barely knew, her understanding that sometimes the right thing to do was also the dangerous thing to do. Some debts could only be paid in suffering, but others could be paid in service. Troy had paid his debt to his children by protecting them from those who would harm them. Now his children would pay their debt to the world by protecting others who couldn't protect themselves. The circle was complete, the legacy secured. The Sinclair name would stand for loyalty, justice, and the absolute certainty that betrayal carried consequences. In the end, that was all any parent could hope for. Children who understood the difference between right and wrong, and who had the courage to act on that understanding regardless of the cost. Troy Kellerman was finally at peace. Troy Sinclair was ready for war. The family that hunted together stayed together, and they would never stop hunting. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.